The time has come to talk about CSS. CSS is that third layer, that third shell of enhancement and added functionality that goes onto the core of the content. So on the very core, you have just plain your content, what you're communicating. The next shell around that is HTML, which provides the meaning and the structure for the document. And then on top of that is the CSS, which provides the style, the look, and the feel. So the CSS hooks into the different elements that you've put there with HTML. So HTML and CSS, their relationship is sort of like the relationship between a nerdy guy who is just all functionality. He's always like talking about really nerdy things and arguing semantics and worried about details of like how things technically mean. He uses words like technically a lot. And CSS is like this fashionable woman who is always concerned with style and colors and the way things look and the way things feel. And so these two people on their own kind of don't work. The really nerdy HTML functional guy, on his own, his place looks awful. It's just all functional stuff. He doesn't have anything that looks good. There's no decoration. There's nothing on the wall. It's just pure whatever it takes to get things done. He doesn't know how to dress. He dresses, well, he says dressing is just to like keep you warm. Technically, he has just a purely functional mindset. The meaning of clothes is to keep you warm. Now CSS comes in, and without HTML, she's all fluff. It's just style, and there's no real content. It's just all this like colors and enhancements, and when they come together though, they make this powerful thing because they've got function and style. They've got the presentational side of it, and they've got the meaningful side of it. And when you enhance the meaning with a look and feel, you get this beautiful combination that just really works. You've got the power behind the style, and you've got the look and feel and the good-looking CSS behind the HTML, and together they make this like amazing dynamic duo. So it's important that you learn CSS right at the very outset, right as you're still learning HTML. So you probably at this point have not got much HTML technically, but that's okay. You got to start learning CSS because you're going to be tempted to try and make things look good using HTML, and that's just not going to work. That's like relying on the nerdy guy's fashion sense. He does things like he wears brown shirts with brown belt, brown pants, and brown shoes, all the same brown because he thinks it matches. But CSS comes in and she has fashion sense and color sense, and it makes it look better. So don't try and style with HTML. It's like dressing nerdy. You want to dress well. You want to dress up your website with CSS. Use her fashion sense. That's what she's good at. But use HTML as well. Don't abandon HTML. Use HTML's understanding of what things actually mean. Technically, his nerdy technical understanding of things, because he's what's going to make your website accessible to lots of different people with different types of disabilities, different types of browsers, different types of computers, and even non-people, computers that are crawling the internet trying to get information about your website. It's going to make your website connected to different parts of the internet, to Google, to the semantic web, and all of that. So your first CSS, let's go ahead and write some CSS. So we talked about attributes in the last session. So it kind of makes sense that CSS would be an attribute of a certain element. So say you go back to your page and you have your heading, your index.html from your homework, and you gave it a heading, hopefully, an H1 first level heading. And you want it to look a little bit better than just the plain old HTML formatting style that got put in there. So what you're going to do is you're going to add an attribute. Now this is a little bit tricky because you're going to add an attribute, first of all, to tell it that this is CSS you're doing. So the attribute name is style. Now remember how you write an attribute. You go into the H1 element, and after the element name, after the tag name, so after the H1, you put a space, and that's where you write the attribute name, and then equals, and then the attribute value. So the attribute name is style because this is style. The attribute that we're adding is CSS, and the name for that attribute is style. Okay, so style equals, and then put quotes, and in here that's where we're going to put our CSS. But here's where it gets really tricky, because we're like doubling up the name value pair thing. Okay, so you've got multiple layers here. You've got the element name, you've got the attribute name, and then you have the CSS attribute names. You have the CSS property names is actually what we call them, because there's different we don't want to just have like, what are you going to put in here? What are you thinking? CSS, okay, so you have style equals, and you put your CSS. What are you going to put? Are you going to put 10 pixels if you want the size of the font to be 10 pixels? How does it know that you want that to be size and not the height or the width? You have to also specify within this attribute a name value pair of the CSS that you're working on. So I'll give you a couple of things you can do. So first of all, let's make it a different size. So you're going to put, we're going to make the font size be 12 pixels. We're going to make it small, just to see that you can make small headings if you want. Now you can't just put 12 pixels, obviously. So what you put is font dash size colon 12px. So look at this. This is getting confusing, right? But you have a name value pair within the CSS, and we can't use equals again, because then it would be style equals font size equals. There'd be too many equals, and the browser wouldn't know which ones go where. So instead of an equal sign, we use a colon. So font dash size. Now you just use that little hyphen, the little minus key, just the one that's right on your keyboard next to the plus key. It's the same key as the underline key if you hold shift. And so font dash size colon 12px. The px is the units, and whenever you have something that's a number, you always have to have the units. So if you do this, save it, you'll refresh and see that the font size has gone down. Now let's go ahead and change the color. Let's add another property, another CSS property into our h1 element, into our h1 tag, into the style attribute of our h1 tag. Okay, so don't get too worried about the syntax and the semantics of what I'm saying. It doesn't matter if you know when I say style attribute and element and tag and all this. It doesn't matter if you follow exactly all of what I'm saying. What's important is that when you see it laid out like this, you understand that this is an HTML attribute, and in here is where you put all your CSS, and that this is the property and this is a value. You don't have to know the names of these things. I'll use the names, the technical names, but you just have to know how to use it. You just have to be sure that you don't try and put an equals sign here or a colon here. You just have to know the syntax, okay? So to change the color, we have to put in another CSS attribute, and we have to put it right after that other CSS property that we put in. So we have the font size. Now we're going to put within that same attribute, inside that style attribute, inside those quotes, we have to also put the color, okay? So this is all within the same HTML attribute, all within the same style. So the style equals both font size and color. So they're both going in these quotes, okay? And we need a way to distinguish the one CSS property from the other, the font size from the color. And the way we're going to do that, okay, a comma would make sense. But we're not going to use comma. Commas are a common way to separate different things like this, right? We're going to use a semicolon. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly why they chose to use a semicolon. In a lot of programming languages, you use a semicolon to kind of like end a statement. You like to end like a phrase. Semicolons are kind of like periods in a lot of programming worlds. Like in JavaScript, whenever you have like a statement, you put a semicolon at the end like that. So put a semicolon after this 12px semicolon. And that says that's the end of this CSS property. And then the browser knows anything after that is a new one. So go ahead and put color colon, okay, remember not equals, and then you can put a color. Now there's a lot of ways to put colors in. There's different values. So you can use hex codes, you can use RGB values, or you can use HTML color codes. Now it'll be easiest for this example to just use the HTML color code. I don't know how many there are, maybe like 60 or so names you can write out, like green, red, blue, a lot of the common ones, and even things like chartreuse. So go ahead and put green. We're going to change it to green, G-R-E-E-N. And because it's spelled out like this, we don't need to put a unit. So go ahead and put that and then put a closing semicolon again. Even though we're not going to like separate out, we don't technically need it to separate between, like you wouldn't put a comma at the very end, right? But it just makes sense to always put this closing semicolon after each property so that if you ever mix things around and change the order, you won't get messed up. And it's just good practice. It's kind of technically correct. So go ahead and put that closing semicolon now. Now save and refresh, and you will see that the properties have been applied. So attributes and properties, CSS properties, the property is the actual name of the style that's being applied. Now you could call it an attribute, but we're already using the word attribute to describe HTML attributes. So that's why this vocabulary is kind of like, they kind of crash into each other. So remember, attributes are attributes that go in the HTML, and properties are all CSS, okay? And you won't get these confused because when you're in the CSS context, you never have this equal sign syntax. When you're in the HTML syntax, you always have the equal sign and you don't have this colon or semicolon in there. Okay, so you've just written some CSS. You can go wild here, but we're running into a problem, and we're going to fix this with a principle called DRY, don't repeat yourself. So the principle of dry says that you shouldn't repeat yourself if at all possible. So say you have multiple paragraphs and you want to put some styling on each of those paragraphs. Even if you wanted all the paragraphs to have the same styling, the way you'd have to do this is you'd have to put in each P element style equals and then the CSS properties, and then copy that, paste into each one. Then if you want to make a change later on, you have to go in and find each one, manually replace it, change it, replace it one at a time. So this is why we have this principle DRY, because it makes it very difficult to modify anything and update anything, and it just makes it hard to do it the first time around, to set it up the first time. So CSS has this powerful ability to actually create the CSS in one place and have it apply to the entire page, and not just indiscriminately to the entire page, but just to the parts of the page that you want it to. This is really cool. So the way to do this is we're going to stop playing with HTML attributes. We're going to go up to the top of the page into the header. So inside that, so you have HTML and then header. Inside header, before the body tag, inside the header tag, inside there, we're going to create an element called style. Okay, so it's going to have the open caret style, close caret, that style tag, and then the closing style tag. So style, close style. And then inside there, we're going to write CSS that'll apply to the entire page. So it makes sense that it's in the header, right? So go ahead and write some CSS that we want to apply to all of the paragraphs. So you'll have, do something like this. Give it, say, margin colon 10px. This will give a little margin around all of your paragraphs, a 10 pixel margin. Now, margins and padding are a little bit similar and a little bit different, but we'll talk about that later. So we're going to give it a margin of 10 pixels. Go ahead and do that. Now, how do we have this apply to the entire page, but just the paragraphs? How do we do it? Well, we're going to write a little bracket around the beginning and around the end to separate this from other things. And then before that, we're going to write the selector. Now, the selector is the way that we select the part of the page that we want to target. So if we just want to select all the P elements, all the paragraphs, we use the selector that targets just all of those. And there's a way to target an HTML element using the tag name in CSS. So you put the HTML tag name of the element that you want to select, and it'll select all of them. So put P, curly brace, and then your property and property value, and then close that curly brace. And so now it knows that everything in between these two curly braces, that's the style that's going to be applied. And then the selector, it'll target all of the P elements. So you can only, obviously you can only put the names of HTML elements here, and you can only put HTML elements that actually appear in your document. So if you don't have any P tags, this P is going to do nothing. It won't apply this padding this margin to anything. But if you do, it'll target just those P elements. So if you go ahead and save this and refresh your browser, you should see a little bit of a change in your paragraphs, how they're laid out. So let's talk a little bit more technically about what this syntax means. And again, it doesn't matter actually that you learn all the vocabulary for the technical meaning of what these are. What's important is that you learn how to do it and how to use it. If you've been coding along as we go, that's great. If not, don't worry, but start right now, code along for our in-session project. What we're going to do is we're going to clean up our code a little bit. So right now, our CSS is in two places. It's in the style element, HTML tag element in the header, and it's in the style attribute, HTML attribute in the H1 element. Okay? So we need to clean this up and put it all in one place. And it's generally poor practice to actually use the style attribute because it violates DRY, don't repeat yourself. So let's dry up our page a little bit and let's put these two rules, the rule about the paragraphs and the rule about the first level heading, up into our style element, into our style tag. What I want you to do is copy just the CSS from the style attribute that's in the H1 tag. So remember, the attribute name is style, then there's an equal sign, and then in quotes you have the attribute value. So copy the whole attribute value, not including the quotes, just the value. So the first thing will be F for font style, and the last thing will be that final semicolon. So copy all of that, and then go up into your style element, up in the header, and find the rule that you wrote about the paragraphs, and below it hit enter a couple of times and put the CSS that you just copied right there below it. So now you'll have the paragraph rule that selects the paragraphs and then the curly braces for the selectors, for the properties of that rule. And then below that, you'll have this random CSS properties that isn't targeted anywhere. So I want to see if you can figure out how to make it target this random CSS that you just pasted in. See if you can figure out on your own how to make it target just that H1 element. Okay? So pause now and try that. And don't worry if you didn't get it figured out. But let me explain to you how to do it. What you're going to do is use that P that was above for paragraphs as a model, and you're going to write another selector for just that H1. So what you write is H1, which selects H1 elements, or H1 tags. Elements and tags I use interchangeably. You select the H1 with that, and then you put the curly braces around all of the rules that are going to be used by that selector. So you have the whole rule, and then within that rule, the components are the selector, and then the properties and property values. And the properties are within this curly brace. So go ahead, and if you didn't get it quite right, fix up your code and save it and refresh it and see what you've got. So now we have two rules. One rule about paragraph tags or paragraph elements, and one rule about the H1 element. So we might run into a problem here, particularly if you want to style your H1 element to look a certain way only when it's at the top of your page. But you also want to use first level headings in other parts of your page, but you don't want them to look the same as that top one. So right now, just as the P selector selects all of the P elements, if you put an H1 lower in your page and you don't change this rule, you're going to get all of them looking the same. So how do we target just the one that we want up top, just that top one? So the method that we use is we have to assign a class. Now I'm sorry if this vocabulary is just getting out of control confusing, but if you think about it, it kind of makes sense that we have two classes of H1 elements. We have the top level that we want to look one way, and then we have a second class of all these other ones. class or type or category. So we have two categories, two classes of H1 elements. And the way that we need to use HTML to tell CSS the distinction between these categories is by assigning a class. HTML has another attribute named the class attribute. The name of the attribute is class, and the value is any class that we give it. So we actually should add this class attribute to that first H1 element. So go to your H1 element and by the way, delete the style equals attribute. We don't need it anymore. So just go ahead and delete that. And instead, we're going to write an attribute in the H1 element, class equals, and then put quotes. And then within those quotes, we're going to make up a class name. You can make up any class name you want. We might call this top or first, because it's the top or the first heading, and then the rest of the H1s, if we write them later, are going to be of a different class. So go ahead and give it the class top, for example, TOP within the quotes. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go up and we're going to specify that we only want the H1 elements that have this top class to have the coding that we put. So we find that rule, scroll up to your style element, and find that rule that we wrote for the H1. And now how are we going to modify this so that it only selects, it only targets the H1s that have the class top. So we're going to go in the selector because we're changing what it selects, what it targets. And we can't just write top, because with our syntax, if you just write a word here, it'll think it's an HTML element, right? So we need a way to distinguish that this is not just an HTML element. It's not looking for top. It's looking for a class called top. And the way we do this is with a dot or a period. So you put a dot and then the word top. So no space between the period and the class name. So you put dot and then the class name, in this case top. And that will tell the browser that we are looking for something that has a class name of top. And we can actually attach it to the H1 element as well. So for now, let's simplify things. Delete the H1 element. I'll show you how to connect them later. But right now, just write dot TOP in place of where the H1 was. So no space between the dot and the class name. Now, if you save this and refresh it, you won't see a change because the class has is on the same element that it used to be targeting. So it's targeting the same exact element. It's targeting the same place. It's selecting the same place, but it's selecting it in a different way. Instead of selecting it using the element name or the tag name, it's selecting it using the class name. So now though, if we want to write other H1 elements lower in the page, they won't be targeted by this selector unless we give it this class as well. So go ahead and write a couple other H1 elements if you're curious about this, and you'll see that as you write these other ones and save and then refresh your browser, they look different. They don't have that same CSS applied to them. So you're going to get a chance in the project after this lesson, so not the in-session project, but the project kind of like after the homework, to learn a bunch more CSS properties, and you'll be able to like style up your page and make it look really cool using CSS. But before we get into that, I want to teach you a strategy using a really cool tool that is probably already built into your browser. So it's called the Browser Inspect tool. And what it does is it allows you to view the source of the page in a really particularly useful way. So in the last lesson, we learned about how to view the source. So most Windows computers, it's Control-U. It might be something like Command-Option-U if you're on a Mac, or if you're like on Internet Explorer or some other browser, you might have to go into the View menu and find source. So go ahead and do that again now if you are able. Now, what you'll see is on your page, you see that the code that is shown up in the source is almost identical to the code that is in your text editor, which makes sense because it's showing you the source. And of course, you can view the source of any page on the internet. But it's not actually the most helpful because especially on bigger pages, it gets out of control really quickly. It's hard to scroll through all of this stuff and find what you're looking for exactly. So there's a better way. And this is also particularly useful for writing CSS because it allows you to make changes on the fly to the code. Just temporary changes. You're not able to save them, but I'll show you how to do that. The browser inspect tool has different names in different browsers. A lot of browsers will call it the DOM inspector. The DOM. And the reason we call it that is because it's actually looking at the DOM. Now, what is the DOM? No. So DOM sounds scary, but it's not scary. Don't be scared by DOM. The DOM. DOM stands for Document Object Model. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about remembering what it stands for. But what it is it's basically the source code. Remember how in the last session we viewed the source and were able to look at the source code, all of the HTML and all that stuff that was in there? The DOM is also the source code, but it's not exactly the source code. The source code is just the source code, the code as you've written it. The DOM is the computer's understanding of that source code. It's like a theoretical mental map of the source code that the browser has in its mind. So it's sort of like if my wife writes me a shopping list, and she might actually write down like instructions, do this, this, this in this order. And I'll read that list, but while I'm walking around in the store, I may not actually just always be reading this list word for word as I go. I kind of have built a mental list in my head. So that mental list it should be, if I'm not being silly, if I'm not forgetting things, it should be the same as what's on the actual physical list, but the mental list is like abstract and theoretical. And so I kind of maybe organize it a little bit differently. I don't, maybe I don't think of it in the exact same way that, that the list is written. And maybe I even make some minor changes, like if there was a spelling error or if she did something weird in the list, I might kind of like fix it up so that it makes sense in my brain. And browsers do a very similar thing with the code. They read the code and then they parse it. When a browser reads the code, it's called parsing. So they parse the code and then they create this DOM, this mental understanding that is the structure of the page. It's not always exactly the same as the source code that you wrote. For example, it strips out the white space. If you put spaces and hit enter, hit return, the browser doesn't actually need that white space to understand how to like build the page. So that's not a part of the DOM. And if you, for example, have bad syntax and you make some mistakes in your code, and if it's able to correct that, if it's able to figure out what you meant, say for example you write a list item element and you put the starting tag and then the list, but then you don't put the closing list item tag, and then you start a new list item. So the browser is now smart enough to say, okay, lists are always one after another. There's no other elements that come between them. And so if I see another list item starting, then I'm going to assume that this last one ended. So the browser will in its DOM, will put that closing list item tag into its DOM for you. So we're going to get to look into the mind of the browser with the DOM inspector. We're going to actually see this code as it's parsed into this tree. So normally what we see is the rendered version of that code, but now we're going to see the actual source code as it's in the mind of the browser. So here's the videos for how to get the browser inspect tool set up and running for the browser that you're using. Generally, what you're going to do is find that inspect, and in the bottom of your browser, there's going to pop up this whole magical web developer wonderland of all of this stuff. So the first thing you'll see is on the left, the DOM. Again, just this mental understanding of the source code, but it's structured out perfectly and kind of like fixed up. So you'll see sometimes that the elements are collapsed into each other. So we talked about nesting last time. So if you have one element that's inside of another element that's inside of another element, the browser may show these as collapsed up, so you only see that top element. And the children elements, the descendant elements, are actually inside there, but you can't see them unless you click a little plus button or icon, and then you'll kind of like see it expand out. So this is actually a very efficient way to like run through code and get a feel for it yourself. So go ahead and look at the DOM and explore it a little bit and see if you can make sense of your page and understand it. So say you want to change the size of our heading because our heading is too small. But we don't want to have to go to our code, change the font size, go back and refresh, see and check and see if it's the size we wanted. And then if it's not the right size, go back to our code, change the font size again, guess and check, go to our browser, check to see, oh, it's still not quite the right size. Back and forth, this could take a long time. So one of the cool things about this tool is it allows you to modify your page within the browser without affecting the code. What you're modifying is the DOM. You're modifying the browser's mental understanding of this page. Now you won't be able to save these changes, but it'll help you like play with it a little bit and see it as you're playing with it to get what you're looking for. So in your DOM inspector, go ahead and bring your mouse cursor over one of the elements. And there's a distinction between putting your cursor over the element name, the actual tag name, and then the like values and attributes that are within it. So if you put it over the attribute, for example, it's not quite the same as putting it over the element. So when I say put it over an element or put it over a tag, I mean the tag name. And if you do that, as you move it over different elements, you'll see that it's highlighted in the browser, in the page. You can see it actually showing you which element is being highlighted. It'll give you the outlines of it, and it'll show you the margins and the padding in different colors. Now this is different on different browsers, but often the margin is purple and the padding is yellow, unless I have that backwards. Anyway, you'll get used to understanding this in the future, but it'll show you the height, the width, it'll show you where it is, and if you click on that, click on the element name, again, don't click on like the attribute, click on the element name, the tag name, and then in that right pane, what you'll see is the CSS that applies to it. So this will, on complicated pages, be very big. You'll have to scroll through a lot. But on a simpler page, it's a little bit simpler. So again, on different browsers, there's different ways that they show this, but one of the little windows that they have is the CSS rules that are being applied to that element. So at the top, you'll see sometimes an empty rule for you to put new things in, and then you'll see usually categorized from most specific to least specific, and don't worry about what that means quite yet. We'll talk about it later, but it basically means the things that are applying that are have higher priority to lower priority, a list of all the rules, and you'll even see the default browser CSS rules. So you can actually see, really, you can see the guts of all this. You can see the CSS that you didn't write. It's just part of the browser defaults for HTML. Cool. Now, click on your H1 element, the one that we wrote the class for, and remember to click on the tag name. So you'll see, if you can find it in that right area, you should be able to find that class, the selector, which contains the class, and then the whole rule, the different properties that you wrote. And say you want to change the size, double click in the value of the font size, and you'll see it change from kind of like being uneditable to being in an editable state. Now this is a little tricky because different browsers kind of do this in a different way, and also they sometimes change the way that this works between browsers versions. So it might be a little bit different on your system, but it's usually double click within the within the property value to get it to like go into its editable state. And if that doesn't work, you might have to just kind of like click around and try different things until you get it to work for your DOM inspector. But eventually, if you'll figure out how to like what the technique is to bring it into this editable state, and then you can edit it. So you can do a couple things. You can type a new value and then see it right there, change right before your eyes. Or you can, if it's something like a certain number of pixels, like numeric units, and then there's a unit afterwards, you can use the up and down arrow key, and that'll actually scroll through kind of, and you'll see it updating as you use the up and down arrow key to increase or decrease the value. So you'll be able to see it actually changing size, and you can find just the size you want. And then you can edit this. You can modify the amount that goes up and down when you're using the arrow keys by using Shift and Alt and Control sometimes to kind of like make it bigger jumps or smaller jumps. But go ahead and play with that a little bit until you get it the size you want. Now, once you have it the size you want, remember, when you reload this page, you're going to lose this change because this is just a change to the DOM. It's just the browser's understanding of the page. You haven't changed the code. So you have to actually change the code too. So what you do is once you get it to the size you want, look at the actual value. So you have to, of course, know where you are. It'll show you the whole rule. It'll show you the selector and then the property and then the property value. So with that in mind, remember the property value and then go to your code. Find that same place, find that same rule with the same selector and the same property, and then when you see the value, replace the old value with the new value just from memory, or you can even copy and paste that value into your code, save it, and then refresh it. And if you did it right, your page won't change. So this is you using the DOM. You're navigating the DOM. The DOM is kind of like, it's this tree of inheritance. It's kind of like, you know, those Russian dolls where they put one inside of another, except it's a lot more complicated. We call it the tree. You can like collapse it all the way up to the root, and then you can just see the root element, and then you can start from there. Or you can right click on the page on the actual element that you want to see. Right click on the one you want to see and go to inspect, and then it'll take you there in the DOM. It'll scroll through, it'll uncollapse and expand and highlight just the element that you clicked on. And sometimes it's a little bit confusing because elements are kind of in front of each other, and the one that you clicked on isn't the one you thought you clicked on, but usually take you to a very close place, and you can kind of like navigate through the DOM to find the exact element that you're looking for. And you can make lots of changes. You can actually totally code a whole page just in this DOM inspector. You could write the whole CSS and everything, and then lose it when you refresh. Probably not a good idea to do that. There's a lot of really cool features in this DOM Explorer. It's actually more than just a DOM Explorer. It's more than a browser inspect. It's a whole wonderland of tools. So I'm going to make a separate video just to show you all these different tools, and I want you to at least look at some of this video if you can, going through this course, but I'm going to say this is recommended watching. It's not required. Just skim it if you're not totally interested, but definitely come back to this when you want to know a little bit more about how to use the browser inspect tool.